Since the dawn of virtual reality, it's had one major problem, that of motion sickness. In the decade or so since we've had the first affordable home VR headsets, there's been various attempts to fix the problem of motion sickness, but none so far has worked in all situations. RotoVR thinks they've nailed it with a spinning chair called the RotoVR Explorer. And before you laugh, I think they actually might have. At least for me, it worked. I'm James Bruce, you're watching WindowsReport.com reviews. This is the RotoVR Explorer, a rotating chair with built-in rumble pack, made for the Meta Quest, but certainly not limited to the Meta Quest. It can be used with any kind of headset. But let's back up a little. Why do you even get motion sickness when playing VR? So motion sickness occurs when there's a mismatch between what your brain thinks is going on and what your body is telling you is actually happening. So lots of people get this in a car because if you close your eyes or you're reading a book looking down while your body is hurtling forwards at 60 miles an hour, there's a mismatch and your brain doesn't know it. It occurs a lot in VR games with free motion because of the reverse. Your brain thinks it's moving forwards, it's getting these visual clues of, say, spinning around, when actually it isn't. You're just standing or sitting in one spot. There are a few workarounds for this. You can use sort of teleport mechanics that just put you straight over there, but that breaks any sense of immersion for me. You can play only in mixed reality where you don't have a mismatch because you're literally moving around your play space, which is fine if you own a warehouse, less useful at home. Or you can just power through it and just build up a tolerance to feeling sick. And this is probably the most common tactic. But even for me, after a decade of using VR, I still get a bit queasy in certain games. The other mitigating tactic is to match up your virtual actions with the real world in some way. And this last category is where things like motion simulators come in, which can do a remarkable job of emulating that feeling of sort of surging forwards as you accelerate in a car or tilting left and right when you take a corner. So I've taken this to an extreme on the Your VR chair and added some high-speed fans at the front to give a feeling of rushing air, which is of course absurd because in a racing car you wouldn't have the windows open, but it doesn't matter. The point is that giving these subtle clues to your brain, or not so subtle hints, that push it just far enough into the realms of actual reality that you don't get motion sickness. The RotoVR Explorer falls into this last camp of VR accessories, somewhere sort of halfway to a full motion simulator. But more importantly, it tackles the rotation or spinning aspect, which is the #1 cause of motion sickness. For some reason, moving forwards or backwards just isn't as bad as spinning. So the RotoVR Explorer is a chair that spins in coordination with your virtual actions. It has two modes of operation, which I'll talk about later, but first up, construction and hardware. It arrives in a large 33 kilogram package and there's a fair bit of construction to do. It took me about an hour to put it together, but it's not particularly difficult, just a bunch of bolts. Do be sure to read through the instructions though, because there's a couple of bits where it's easy to mess up. Taking a look at the finished product, you have a 6-armed base, on top of which sits a protective shield. This is not optional, there are magnetic sensors on this, and if you remove it, the chair won't work. It's a critical safety feature designed to stop your feet from getting caught between the footrest and the arms of the base. So there's a footrest and a built-in rumble pack under the chair, and the backrest is rather short and basic. Now, interestingly, there's mention of various upgrade kits in the manual which include a better backrest, as well as a place to mount a steering column. Very cool. Also built into the base is power and control buttons, as well as a wireless charging pad for this head tracking puck. Again, more on that in a moment, but I like the fact that it tucks away into the base when not in use and will automatically charge wirelessly if you have the chair powered on. Really thoughtful design there. Now, with any VR accessory, the software is always going to be the biggest frustration because it's very difficult to add support for third-party peripherals, especially on a platform like the Meta Quest. What's genius about the RotoVR is that it doesn't actually need any software, and that's the primary mode of operation that you'll be using with virtually any game. The way RotoVR works to alleviate motion sickness is by moving your body when you turn to look at something. They call it look to turn, thereby allowing you to turn in-game without using any software, and it eliminates any mismatch between what your brain is feeling from the real world and what you're doing in the game. So it does this by allowing your head to control the rotation. This little tracking puck simply attaches to your head strap and tracks your head movements. If you look left or right, the chair will follow. This is an amazing solution because it doesn't need software support. It's all done in the hardware. Now, my biggest fear coming into this review is that the list of games it supported would be very small. But this mode of operation of look to turn will work with literally any game, albeit with varying degrees of usefulness. I have to admit I was skeptical about this, but actually having now tried it with a ton of my favourite games, it really does work well. And although it's made for meta, there's no reason it won't work with any wireless headset or streaming from your PC with Steam VR. Because it's hardware independent, it doesn't need that software support. The only restriction is really the type of games that it suits and whether you can reconfigure the controllers to either disable or just completely ignore the usual smooth thumbstick turning. On Rec Room, for instance, this is easy. I can just ignore the right-hand joystick while allowing the left to continue controlling sidestep, forwards, backwards movement. I found Rec Room, in fact, worked really well with RotoVR, but I will add a caveat that it doesn't normally give me any motion sickness anyway because I use snap rotation, where tapping the joystick left or right will literally snap me 90 degrees, a bit like teleporting. But other than that, I have all the guardrails and goggle vision comfort things disabled. But playing Rec Room with RotoVR felt really comfortable and natural compared to me just standing up and sort of using the joystick. It's a room scale game. You can turn around and move around literally within your room, but I'm very lazy and don't or just forget to. And with this, it worked perfectly. So the RotoVR works really well with any first-person exploration or shooting games, standing or seated VR experiences where your actual body motion can be used in a game and you're exploring a virtual environment. It doesn't work so well with games that have a fixed play space, like say puzzle or tabletop games in front of you. And also in this standard independent hardware mode, most cockpit-based games won't work either. If you think about a racing or a flight sim, then glancing left or right while you're in the cabin, you're just looking out of the windows. It's not useful to then have your whole body turn that way because you just need a momentary glance. But cockpit games can work brilliantly with the RotoVR if you use the second mode of operation. And this is where you have native support within the game itself, as in the software the game you're playing needs to be aware of the RotoVR Explorer. And this is where it's less impressive for now because there's only one game that supports it. Thankfully, it's a game I love, but still. This native mode involves the game talking directly to the chair over Bluetooth, so you no longer need the tracking puck. When you turn in-game using the standard joystick or perhaps even wheel controls in the future, the chair moves appropriately to match the in-game actions. And the reason this needs native support and not just, say, an OS-level driver to read joystick input is because you need to compensate for the motion. So if you think about turning 90 degrees on the joystick to rotate in the game turns you 90 degrees. And then the RotoVR simultaneously turns you 90 degrees in the real world. Well, technically, now in the game, you've turned 180 degrees because you've got the virtual 90 plus the physical 90 degrees of motion. So when you're using a motion platform like this, you need to compensate for that motion in real life. Effectively cancel out or ignore the extra movement that you get from the game virtually. So just to clarify, that doesn't happen with the standard hardware tracking mode because you're not stacking up rotations. It's entirely independent. It's literally just you having your body moved around. Now, the one game that supports this at launch is Dig VR, and I'm really digging it. It works well because you're in a cab, a cockpit, and one of the virtual joysticks controls turning that cab around. The levers also control each track of the digger to move the whole body of the digger around. And honestly, this makes me a bit sick. Even with all the experience that I have, this movement still made me a bit queasy. But with this on the RotoVR Explorer, literally zero sickness. And that's because the cab in the game moves and you in real life move perfectly in sync with it. It's perfectly matched. Of course, there's no backwards and forwards feeling of surge, but you can't have everything, especially at this price point. A copy of Dig VR is included with your purchase of the RotoVR Explorer, but to be clear, it's a great relaxing game anyway. It's not just some tech demo that RotoVR made. I actually bought my copy before hearing about the RotoVR because I love diggers and have a fantasy of digging my own bunker in the garden. This is surprisingly good training. It does actually match up with a real digger. I will also mention that I saw the developer of Iron Rebellion, which is a VR mech game, was also talking about native support for the RotoVR. So hopefully as word of the device gets around and people get over the initial sort of gimmicky shock, it'll gain more support. Now, I also tried with the 360 mode enabled of some rhythm action games like Smash Drums or Beat Saber, and it was less useful there, but only because I don't normally play them in any sort of 360 mode. I find standing up and turning around to hit the different drums kind of tedious when they have an option to disable that anyway, so I just use the sort of forward-facing mode, standing up. The look to rotate feature of the RotoVR works fine in these games, don't get me wrong. It works just as universally as it would in any game. It just doesn't particularly enhance the experience because that 360 motion in a rhythm game isn't necessary. It's just a tacked-on mode for these games to force more physical movement, not to actually create a more immersive environment. Now, one last thing to mention is the rumble pack under here. And it's pretty powerful, but a little less impressive in the standard universal operating mode. So in native support mode, it also talks to the game, and if the game has some rumble feedback to give you, it will do it. So there's various actions controlled by the game which will rumble the pack. Now, personally, I would have liked to see it used a little more, perhaps a stronger kind of engine feeling when you're rolling backwards and forwards in the digger, but that's just my preference. In the universally compatible look-to-turn mode, which, as I mentioned, is a separate hardware-only system with this head tracker puck, you need an audio input into this. And it can be a bit awkward because it means you can't use the built-in headphones anymore on the Meta Quest. You either have to use wireless or wired external headphones. Wired setup is easier, of course, if you have an audio out, which the Meta Quest 3 does, the Meta 2 does as well. The 3S doesn't, so you end up needing a USB-C to audio adapter there. Then you have to split the audio output and put one into the puck and one into your headphones. If you're using wireless headphones, you mustn't pair them with your headset. Rather, you just need to turn them on and wait for the puck to automatically pair with them. It sounds a bit more complicated than it is, but it is a bit of a messy workaround ultimately, when the beauty of the Meta Quest is that of simplicity and sort of all-in-oneness. But aside from the dongle hell of the rumble feature, I'd like to thank RotoVR for actually making a VR hardware accessory that just works. The core feature, the rotating chair and the tracking puck, are really reliable once you've figured it out. I have never come across a VR accessory like that. It's what stops me from using my full motion rig and walking platform more. It's just such a faff with them, getting the drivers updated and checking it's connected, and it's annoying. This is as easy to use as the Meta Quest itself. You just turn it on, put the puck on your headset, it's probably already on it, you press the front button to start and to calibrate. Like, as someone with very little time to game and even less patience for unreliable hardware, I really appreciate when something just works. Should you buy the RotoVR? I'm not going to call it an essential accessory. It's ridiculously good fun and a premium upgrade for your VR experiences. It has enabled me to play fully immersive, standing VR-style games much longer than I normally would be able to, and completely without any sickness that I would normally get from smooth turning. And it really enhances first-person exploration or shooting games. For Dig VR, the only natively supported game at the time of recording, I don't think I could go back to playing without it again. Standing VR games are undoubtedly the highlight of VR, and while obviously immersive, they can be just tiring, and it's one of the reasons people say they don't want to play VR. Like, I get home, I just want to relax with a controller on the sofa. I don't want to get up and walk around. Obviously, seated VR is much easier to play for longer sessions, but generally excludes you from those much better experiences. But with the RotoVR Explorer, it lets you do that. It lets you play standing VR experiences comfortably while still enjoying that complete freedom. Does it solve motion sickness? That's more difficult to answer. Like I said, I had been feeling queasy in Dig VR when turning in the digger cab or when using smooth locomotion on Rec Room. And even for me, as a VR veteran, that made me feel a bit iffy. The RotoVR Explorer has completely solved that, so absolutely it can solve motion sickness. For the universal compatibility mode with head tracking, generally I think the jury's still out, and it will depend on which game you're playing. For something static like Smash Drums or Beat Saber, as far as I know, there's no joystick movement anyway, so there's no motion sickness to solve. And if you weren't expecting your literal real world to spin when looking over there, that in and of itself could be a little bit weird and sickness inducing. For first-person shooters, it definitely helps. I can happily strafe around my opponent or weave in and out of maps really smoothly without issue. Possibly even I would say it's given a competitive advantage there. But it will be subjective, and like I say, I'm already at a pretty high level of VR sickness tolerance. If you're very much prone to motion sickness anyway, the RotoVR Explorer isn't a panacea to solve everything. It may make things worse for you. There are games it very much suits and games it doesn't. Retailing at $800, it is a big ask, so clearly in the realms of premium hardware upgrades, but compared to even pricier VR hardware, this is actually one I use regularly because it's so easy, it's so plug and play to get working. And that's rare. That's a big thumbs up from me. If you can afford it, if you've got that sort of money to spare and you're a big fan of standing VR experiences, but perhaps find them a little bit tiring or even sickness inducing when you use smooth turning and you just wish you had a way to play those longer without getting sick, or even if you're just a massive Dig VR fan, then yes, this is a brilliant addition to your VR's play space. Thanks for watching. Hit like if you found this review helpful, share it with a friend, and consider subscribing to WindowsReport.com reviews for more like this. Until next time.